Well, again, I am so grateful for this opportunity to be with you today, to share with you in this incredible event and the wonderful people that are here. It is my unique honor to know who is coming up and to know what the great things that they have to say. I know there is a certain alchemy that happens when you put together an event like this and you bring together these different perspectives and these different expertise and these different people. And so it is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. And that would be Dr. Peter Enns, who is the Abram S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies here at Eastern University. He is a biblical scholar who teaches and writes on the Old Testament, New Testament, Second Temple Judaism, and the intersection of biblical studies and contemporary Christian faith. He has written or edited over a dozen books, including How the Bible Actually Works, The Sin of Certainty, and The Evolution of Adam. All of which, if you haven't read, you should definitely read. He's the host of the Bible for Normal People podcast, available wherever you listen to your podcasts, and is an active and renowned speaker on matters of the Bible, faith, and contemporary life. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Enns to the stage.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I'm very happy to be at a place where we can do what happened the previous hour, right? I don't take that for granted because you can't, not all Christian spaces allow for that. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And so I'm very happy to be here to share some of what I think. Zach asked me a few months ago if I would want to come here and speak. And I said, how much are you paying me? And he said, not very much. So I said, okay, I'll come, but I'm going to say exactly what I think. But having said that, all kidding aside, I will say exactly what I think, but it's only what I think. See, that's my point. You're going to see a lot of overlap with what was said this morning by the panelists, and I appreciated the questions that were asked. But my purpose here is simply to share how I think about some stuff that relates to humanity and evolution and Christianity. And my goal is to leave a good amount of time for thoughts and questions and conversation. And toward that end, I'm going to be more or less reading something. I hope that's not terribly boring, but I'm doing that for your sake, because I wouldn't stop until 3:30 this afternoon if you just, start talking. So, all right. So, not long ago, the Smithsonian Magazine posted an article featuring the absolutely cutest little lion cub you will ever want to see. And her name is Sparta. And you just want to hug her, were it not for the fact that she's been frozen solid in the Siberian permafrost for the last 28,000 years. Now, what makes this cub rank so high on the huggability scale is how well preserved she is. She looks like she's about to wake up, stretch, and just headbutt you, or claw your face off, whatever they did back then. So cave lions were a thing during the last ice age, and humans drew cave pictures of them. And I'm sure Sparta, or frankly any other lion, probably wasn't anyone's cave pet. But seeing that picture of her lying there, just sleeping, struck me how much a 28,000-year-old lion cub can look at home today. If we had well-preserved humans from so long ago, I'd be saying the same thing about then. So if this long-dead, adorable feline could look so recognizable today, I'm left pondering, despite the passage of tens of thousands of years, how different we are really from those ancient humans who roamed the earth, frozen earth, and drew kitty pictures on cave walls. Now, along those lines, my own existence seems trivial when I think about how long humans have been around doing very human-like things. Cave art goes back, again, to my understanding, if you guys can correct me with dates later, I'd have no problem with that, but cave art goes back at least 40,000 years. At least 15,000 years ago, ancient travelers migrated from Asia to become true Native Americans, the first settlers of the continent I will occupy for the few short years that I have. The oldest known boat, the Pessie canoe, is about 10,000 years old, and recent evidence suggests that humans were traveling over water in boats or rafts at least 70,000 years ago. We know from cave paintings that Mongolians held wrestling matches 7,000 years ago, when, according to the first chapter of the Bible, the cosmos was still trapped in a cosmic, primordial, chaotic ocean known as the Deep. The Sumerians in modern-day Iraq were brewing beer 6,000 years ago, around the time when the Bible says God created light. And humans have also had religious sensibilities for thousands of years, far longer than the three Abrahamic religions have been around. At a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered an 11,000-year-old structure that many have interpreted as a temple, which would make it the oldest one known to date. Now, whether or not this is the case, people across the globe, and with no contact to the ancient Israelites, have been worshiping some deity or deities long before the Israelites came on the scene. Stonehenge also appears to have religious significance and was built 5,000 years ago, 1,000 years before Abraham, and who is Israel's first ancestor. See, God may be beyond time, but it's easy for me to fall into the trap of thinking that my religious tradition is as well. The fact, though, is that humans have been around for eons, and for most of that time, they have known nothing of the religious faiths and conceptions of God that I take for granted today. The oldest of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, has been around for roughly 3,000 years. A mere 1% of the total time humans, more or less, like us, have roamed the earth, about 300,000 years. And I struggle with this. I'm left wondering how the other 99% of the human drama connects with the God I have come to accept as the one who always was. How do the so-called ancient stories of my tradition, starring Moses and David and Jesus and Paul, how that relates to a human saga that is vastly older and more complex than this tradition can account for, which I think, Zach, was largely your point in the comments you were making before, right? See, it's the antiquity of it all that makes me interrogate my faith. What does God think about this other 99%? I've always heard that God has a plan, but does that plan include the ancient architects who were driven to construct Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe? And if so, how? If not, my tradition begins to feel rather limited to the last microsecond of recent history. Does the God of Abraham look lovingly upon cave drawings and temples dedicated to the only gods ancient humans could have known? My inherited faith never dwelt on any of this. Perhaps the signal they were unwittingly sending was that this 99% is just a dispensable prelude, a warm-up act to us, the main event, the truly special humans that God actually cares about. But Sparta suggests otherwise to me, as do the discoveries of ancient canoes, temples, and beer brewing. Their humanity, for me, cannot be questioned. So that raises the other question, where are God and Jesus in all of this? By the way, I'm not going to answer that question. So close the doors, nobody leaves. I know you're all disappointed now, so okay. All I can say is that my theology can't ignore what the study of human history has brought to my attention. And I find it curious, however, even a bit frustrating that at least in my circles, few Christians struggle with humanity's long, diverse, strange, and yet strangely familiar saga. And the Bible does not help, really, in addressing my questions, and understandably so, seeing as how its writers had zero interest in, let alone knowledge of, tens of thousands of years of humanity, nor has most of Christian history. We seem to be in uncharted territory these days. The study of the past has challenged how I understand God's activity in the world and what it means to be human. And I feel that my inherited conceptions of God are too limiting. They leave no room for any of this to be discussed. And as it turns out, I need to account not only for the history of humans in the way that I've just been speaking, but for a much more ancient and more familiar story to us, which is the true topic of our gathering here, evolution. Now, judging by the strong reactions it has evoked, I would argue that evolution, as others have said here, remains the intellectual challenge of Christian faith ever since Charles Darwin popularized the theory in the 19th century. Evolution takes us back to a time long before the first humans, to the very dawn of single-cell life, somewhere around, I'm told, I wasn't there, 3.8 billion years ago. The part of the evolutionary chain that would eventually lead to humans, namely creatures walking upright on two legs, began around 2.8 million years ago. Homo sapiens, meaning us, emerged around 300,000 years ago and was once one of several human species, again, as you've heard already this morning. By about 15 to 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only remaining human species, which is to say we won, and the rest is quite literally human history in all its tragedies and triumphs. Now, this scenario is where science has had its most ugly and best-known collision with the Bible. Genesis 1 is quite clear, and I mean this, I'm not trying to be provocative. I think Genesis 1 is quite clear that God created land animals and then humans en masse a few thousand years ago, specifically on the sixth and final day of the act of creation, by simply speaking them into existence. And we've stayed the same, biologically speaking, ever since. This is the refrain of making everything according to its kind. That's it, it's settled. Genesis 2 offers another version of the creation story, one with a different sequence. Not land animals and then humans created en masse, but here God created one man, Adam, out of dirt, then the animals, and then one woman, Eve. Having two such divergent creation stories at the beginning of the Bible is an interesting topic, at least it is for me, in and of itself, but it will not detain us here. The main point is that neither story, Genesis 1 or 2, leaves room for the emergence of humans over millions of years. Okay, so what? Well, a lot of long-cherished Christian ideas about God and the world are rooted in the historical truth of the literal reading of Genesis. And once you bring evolution into the discussion, that very idea begins to take a big hit. For many, a lot is at stake for Christian theology if the biblical story of the creation of humans isn't, at least in some sense, literally, historically true. For one thing, if God did not create directly as us humans, but we are one species that evolved along with millions, and I've read even some suggest billions of species that are on Earth at the present time at least. The question that becomes, okay, if that's how we came about, what makes us so special? What does it mean to be in the image of God? Good question. How could humans be made in God's image, as Genesis 1 suggests, touched directly by God's hand, as it were, if we evolved over millions of years? After many years of keeping these thoughts deeply sealed in my inner vault for all sorts of reasons, there came a time many years ago when I knew I could no longer avoid this predicament. If I wanted to maintain, for me, again, some personal integrity, I think I needed to get into this discussion. And then evolution takes us from being, again, Zach mentioned this point very well, evolution takes us from being the unique center of all of creation and puts us more at the edges. As wonderful as we all are, and we are latecomers, deeply dependent on all that went before us and interconnected with all life forms, which continues to blow me away. All life began as stardust from exploding supernovas. We humans are a product of all that, and we share 98.8% of our DNA with chimps. 90% with cats, if you can believe that, 85% with mice, 80% with cattle, and 61% with fruit flies. We even share about 60% of our DNA with bananas, 50% with trees, 45% with cabbage, and a whopping 26% with yeast. And I will refrain from suggesting that this may well explain how some of my students can manage to fail open book tests, but that's another issue entirely. The biblical story that takes the biggest hit from evolution is, of course, the story of the first couple's unfortunate act of eating the forbidden fruit. As punishment, among other things, God consigned Adam and Eve to mortality, which is said to explain how death entered the world. What turns up the heat for Christians is that this story gets picked up in the New Testament in a big way. According to the Apostle Paul, Jesus, by his crucifixion and resurrection, defeated the problem Adam created, defeated sin and death. So in one fell swoop, evolution wreaks havoc with this largely unquestioned scenario, at least unquestioned for most of Christian history. No first couple caused the world's woes because there was no first couple. Suffering and death, rather than being alien to the world, were, from an evolutionary point of view, a necessary part of the process all along. Death actually propels evolution forward via random genetic mutations, natural selection, and the survival of the fittest. If it weren't, think about this for a second, if it weren't for this death-studded process of evolution that brought us along, Christians today, ironically, wouldn't even be here to ponder whether evolution's true. That was a very profound comment, by the way. You could just, not really. Anyway, evolution was the proverbial bombshell that dropped on the quiet countryside of Christian and, to a lesser extent, Jewish faith. And it had to be addressed somehow. And Christians, at least, I will just limit this to Christians, have handled this, I think, in basically three ways. The first way is, quite famously, by rejecting evolution and sticking with Genesis, read literally, as depicting history. The second is by somehow merging the two, merging the historicalness of the Genesis stories and evolution, merging them together, sort of like creating scenarios where they can both coexist in some way. The third is entirely different way. It's actually neither of the first two, but it's allowing the impact of evolution. And I would suggest other sciences as well, not just evolution, but cosmology, for example, quantum physics, all this kind of stuff. But allowing the impact of evolution to affect how we think about God and how we think about Genesis. I'm very much of that third opinion, and not for me, again, this is me talking, right? This is my opinion. You can accept or reject, whatever. I'm not really a fan of the first two options. I would argue, in fact, that it's the third option that is actually quite faithful to the biblical tradition, more so than the other two options. Why? Because it recognizes, with Paul, for example, that God is revealed in creation. Or Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. You look at physical reality, it tells you something, right? And I think number three, the third option, is the only option, for me at least, that seems to make space for that sort of confession. And so for me, this is the big question before us. Can we envision the Creator in such a way that accounts for what we know of the creation? Can we echo, although we'd have to sort of rewrite this a bit, but can we echo what we read in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God? Can we say other things that we've learned about physical reality likewise tell us something of the glory of God? Even the enemy of Christianity, evolution. Now, just to back up, concerning that first option where you just reject the science, and I appreciate the question that was asked on that here earlier. My answer to that is that I feel that I am in absolutely no position to reject a widely held scientific theory in the sense that Dr. Hayes talked about, like evolution, just on the basis of whether or not I like it or it makes me feel comfortable or uncomfortable. I'm not trained in the field, and I gladly assume that evolutionary scientists are not perpetuating a conspiracy, and they are not utterly incompetent or self-deluded. I have to rely on those who are trained, which includes committed Jews and Christians, by the way. And furthermore, as a biblical scholar, I find that the creation stories, simply on their own terms, don't read like history when compared with other ancient creation stories of the time. In other words, I mean, for me, the issue of humanity and all that, even if you just take evolution off the table, there's a lot of stuff to work through just reading the biblical narratives themselves, right? So, in fact, I think, just focusing on the Adam story, I think the ancient author or authors were quite intent on letting readers know that the story they're writing is not history, at least in our sense, seeing as it includes, stop me if you've heard this one, it includes a talking animal and two special trees with certain powers in the center of that garden. Now, I just want to ask a question, an open-ended question, but do we really think that ancient Israelites thought that animals could talk? I see no reason to assume that. This could simply be a big genre clue. The story, to me, seems to be screaming to us, please read me symbolically, metaphorically, theologically, anything but historically. Now, the second option is, to merge the two seems promising for some, and it does come, I think, from a genuine desire to accept evolution and yet retain a literal Adam in some sense. You want them to work together. But for me, again, this is my opinion, because I know the people at Eastern would disagree with this, and I do respect that, but I'm up here getting paid next to nothing, so I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm actually embarrassed because that's not true. I do have to pick up that Porsche that I'm getting this afternoon, but so thank you for that, all that money. Anyway, but for me, merging together evolution and a literal Adam and Eve in any sense to me is a forced explanation. I mean this, I could be wrong about that. From where I stand, for me, it's a forced explanation. I think it's driven not by the science itself, nor by a serious study of Genesis, at least in its historical context. It seems to be driven more by the need to preserve something of theological importance, which I think many would put as something like biblical authority. Not even inerrancy, but just biblical authority. The Bible has a hold on us and it tells us things that are important, right? So I understand that. But as the conversation goes sometimes, and I've been parts of conversations like this, not here but elsewhere, but something like, sure, evolution is true. Just give me a historical Adam, somehow, in any sense. Again, in order to preserve something that's considered to be of deep value in the Christian tradition. For my tastes, this is a much better option than the first one, I think. But this is a have your cake and eat it too scenario that, for me, creates more problems than it solves. For one thing, it treats evolution not as an all-encompassing theory. Again, Dr. Hayes, I'm thinking about what you said. And it's not just, it's like the cosmos. It's big. A lot of things fall into place. It's sort of a nice theory. But this second option, in my opinion, doesn't treat evolution as an all-encompassing theory with sweeping explanatory power, not complete explanatory power, but with sweeping explanatory power over all of life, at least, not just human life. But it treats it more as sort of a minor bump in the road that can be easily added to our God talk as we now understand it and as we now use it. I think squeezing the biblical Adam into an evolutionary framework yields some hybrid solutions that I've never found convincing. And for example, the genetic data suggests that modern humans were descended from a gene pool of, not to put you on the spot, a few thousand, maybe 5 to 10,000 humans living about the number I've heard 100,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. Hence, as the argument goes, a historical Adam is reframed not as a first couple, but as a first gene pool. Others say Adam and Eve were an actual ancient couple, Homo sapien couple, or others, not the first couple, but a couple somewhere in the evolutionary process that were sort of zapped by God and made into God's image. And so evolution and God's direct creating of a human couple are said to be, a first human couple are said to be preserved that way. At least that's the intention. And again, I've never been drawn to ad hoc arguments like these, because they exist to preserve a perceived doctrinal necessity, which is the historical nature of these ancient stories. And it seems to me a little self-defeating to defend biblical literalism by making Adam into something, a gene pool or a caveman, that the Bible itself literally doesn't remotely leave room for. And this brings me to my point. As different as options 1 and 2 are, remember the reject option and the merger option, as different as they are in temperament, they share, in my opinion, the same problem. Both treat their understanding of God as a given, a certainty, something that is settled and immovable. The new thing, evolution, that's the thing that needs to be either ignored or simply grafted onto existing views of God. Like my friend Dennis Lamoureux. Anybody know Dennis Lamoureux? You need to know that name and just read his stuff. I know you assigned it in the courses here, but he says this idea of like sort of grafting evolution onto, let's say, evangelical theology is like pinning the evolutionary tail on the evangelical donkey, right? The donkey said, just where are we going to put this thing? How is it going to fit, right? But you see, I think of it this way. It's like, okay, God in the Bible, that's over here, and evolution's over here. Well, we got this part down. Let's worry about this. But maybe this has something to teach us about this. That is my main point. And I say maybe. I think there is. But, I have to tell you the truth. We're talking about God here, so I'm sort of out of my area of expertise, and so are the rest of us, right? But is there a conversation that has to happen here? Or is it one or the other? And I think both options, 1 or 2, are still antithetical in a certain sense. What if evolution is alerting us that we need an understanding of God that makes sense in view of evolution? We need a creator who can match the creation. Now, I've, again, made my home in this third option, and scientific discoveries of the physical world, not just biological evolution, but other things as well, they are part of my own internal conversation now about what I think God is like and the language I might use to talk about God. And I don't mean that impulsively or willy-nilly, but I'm hopefully doing this thoughtfully and in community and with complete how can you not be humble talking about this stuff? Like what? Again, this is above my. I can't find my keys half the time, and my glasses are on my head, and it takes me 4 hours to find them. This is out of my area. God, right? So, but we're trying, aren't we? That's the fun, I think, of theology. It's we get to ponder these things and think about things and kick things back and forth, and maybe that's just how children learn. But anyway, all this leads me to consider seriously that evolution is God's way of creating. Of course, the devil is in the details. Exactly what God created by evolution means, and then to work all that out, the implications and all that stuff, well, that's just wide open fields. And I'm very thankful that a lot of theologians have dived into this discussion head first. My main point here, though, is that this question, how does evolution help us understand something of who God is simply a vital question to keep before us in our world today. And it seems to me that at least some of our familiar language of God, no matter how revered, may not be adequate for the task before us. Now, I hope nobody thinks that I invented this third option. I didn't. I'm rather thankful, though, that over the years I've come into contact with Christian and Jewish thinkers who understand the powerful and, I think, inevitable role that science plays, first of all, in our understanding of the natural world. And because it helps us understand something of the natural world, number two, it therefore helps us understand something about the Creator. And that understanding of the Creator, I think, moves us to embrace the mystery of the Creator revealed to us by the mystery of creation. Now, I'm not suggesting that science explains everything. Neither am I saying science doesn't change. In fact, by definition, it does change. But science has uncovered some absolutely amazing things about our universe, namely that evolution is the key for understanding everything from bacteria to galaxies. And again, as a matter of personal integrity, I need to embrace that, maybe we have something new to learn about the Creator as we come to learn something about the creation. Now, a huge and early step for me in moving forward along these lines has been to recognize what countless others have recognized before me, that the Bible is not a book of science. It is not suited to give answers to our scientific questions, nor does it need to be reconciled with science in order to remain religiously potent. The Bible does not speak the language of science, but of faith in God. And this is the key point. If you remember anything, remember this. Science, right? The Bible doesn't use the language of science, but it's a faith in God expressed in ancient ways, in ancient idioms. Where creation happens, say, in 6 days, or a garden houses 2 wonderful trees and a talking serpent. As a biblical scholar, I'm telling you, mining these stories for theological significance is good and right and fascinating and important, but expecting them to somehow be agreeable to what we have learned through recently developed scientific methods using highly tuned technology, I just think that's off the mark. And it does no justice to science, and in my opinion, it can make a mockery of Christian faith to boot. Note Dr. Matthews' question during the Q&A, right? As far back as the 4th century, Augustine understood that Christians should steer clear of discussing cosmology by appealing to the Bible. We're not talking about evolution, it's another topic, but the principle holds, right? Christians should steer clear of discussing cosmology by appealing to the Bible, namely Genesis 1. And he uses some very strong words for those who would appeal to a literal reading of Genesis 1 to explain how the cosmos came to be. And I quote, at least in the English translation here, I quote, "It is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel," I love that word, "for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in a Christian and laugh the faith to scorn." I do wonder what Augustine would say about literal readings of Genesis and evolution, but we'll never know. But we can. In his book, The Great Partnership, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who, by the way, I recall spoke here many years ago. I don't know if some of you were here for that. I missed it, but and he also died, I think, in like 2016. But Very great thinker, but in his book, The Great Partnership between faith and religion, that's what the partnership he's talking about. Rabbi Sachs is at great pains to show that Judaism has historically made room for folding new scientific discoveries into its theology, even to the point of admitting when theology needs to be, hear me, corrected by science. One quick example that I think we're all on board with, if you probe a little bit, is God up there looking down? There's no up. There's no there. Like, where above the clouds, is that where God hangs out? Or is it some galaxy that we're not aware of? Is it like as far as the James Webb Space Telescope? I mean, what does that even mean, right? So technology has forced people to have certain theological conversations about what language do we use to speak of God, right? Now, Sachs, in this wonderful book I do highly recommend, he includes a 15-page appendix at the end, which is where appendixes go, of quotations from various respected Jewish thinkers on several hot topics, including the importance of science for theology, reading the Bible non-literally, the age of the universe, and even evolution. For example, the towering 12th century philosopher Maimonides considered the study of mathematics and physics to be necessary for attaining human perfection. And he insisted repeatedly that Genesis 1 should not be read literally. Instead, to quote him, God described these profound concepts of creation, which his divine wisdom found necessary to communicate to us using allegories, metaphors, and imagery. And in fact, like Augustine before him, Maimonides feared that reading Genesis literally might lead us, I'm quoting him here, might lead us to conceive corrupt ideas and to form false opinions about God, or even entirely to abandon and reject faith itself. Again, I want to come back to Dr. Matthews' comment that, imagine saying that in certain church contexts. By reading Genesis literally, you are corrupting and saying untruthful things. No, I'm reading it literally. Yeah, it's exactly. See, there's a history in Judaism and Christianity that flips the whole question around. They understood, okay, these stories are doing something important, but we've also learned stuff, and we have to take that into account somehow. And how do we do that? That's called theology. Anyway, okay, so Sachs also, just back to cites, he cites 19th century rabbis in his appendix who clearly felt evolution and Jewish tradition were not in conflict, but in actual some conversation. And Christians have done this too. It used to be a little more common, but back in the 19th century, I can add a couple of names to this list of Calvinist Christian theologians. One is B.B. Warfield, the other is Charles Hodge. If those names ring a bell, that's wonderful. If not, that's good too. But they accepted evolution. Now, they struggled with the issue of Adam, but they still accepted this as a scientific fact that we have to deal with theologically somehow. Now, I'm not going to suggest that, Maimonides or anybody else, any of these thinkers would agree necessarily with me or with us or others living in the 21st century, because a lot of water's passed under the bridge over the past 100, 200 years, right? But the principle, this is the thing, the principle of conversation with science is certainly there, not antagonism. In both Judaism and Christianity, there is ample room, not simply for doing science, but for actually accepting the sacred responsibility to bring scientific knowledge into conversation with how we understand God. As Sachs put it, just one brief quote here, he says, "Every new scientific discovery generates new religious insight. By daily renewing creation," Sachs goes on, by daily renewing creation, God is daily renewing revelation, our insight into God's creative will. And how I wish more churches would teach this to their young people. All right, in the current climate, I think such hopeful thoughts as maybe Maimonides or others are too often drowned out by the revving engines of discord. And science and religion have been polarized for centuries, but not because, in my opinion, there is an inevitable conflict between the two. The conflict arose because science collided not with Christianity or even with the Bible, but with literal readings of Genesis. Opposition to science on religious grounds comes disproportionately from those who are not aware of the legacies of Judaism and Christianity, and instead come from a largely option one mentality. Science, stay over there. We don't like you. But the choice between God or science is, I believe, a false one. An option three mindset, which, as I've been saying, has a long and honored pedigree, believes that the world we live in has so much more to tell us about God than we already know. Why? Because maybe God is out ahead of us and always beyond our thoughts. In fact, God is, I would suggest, unimaginably far out ahead of us. So unexpected, so steeped in mystery, so strange to our familiar thoughts about God, that we actually need creation to nudge us along out of our complacency. We need science to shake us loose theologically now and then, lest we fall into the trap of thinking that how we understand things is the way they are. In that sense, science is a real aid in spiritual growth, not its enemy. Now, evolution may be at odds with a literal reading of Genesis, but that does not make it at odds with God, or for that matter, with a reading of Genesis that respects its ancientness and what it's trying to do at that time for that audience. All right. Genesis speaks of God as creator of the cosmos and of all life, but it does so in ways that made sense to those who wrote those stories. They reflect ancient ways of thinking about how things came to be. The authors were offering a portrait of their understanding of God based on their understanding of the physical world. Of course they were, right? With no reason to think otherwise, these authors believed that all the varieties of plants and animals, all mountains and valleys, all oceans and rivers, and every star in the sky are as God made them to be in the beginning and remain fixed and permanent. Life did not evolve. Mountains and earthquakes were not formed by shifts in tectonic plates. Rivers never cut their way through rocks, and stars did not form over millions of years and then explode. Everything was just there, and it was good. With respect to humans, the ancient Israelites knew exactly where babies come from, and reasoning backwards, they knew there was a mass of couples, male or female, in Genesis 1, or at least one person, then another person created Adam and Eve. There has to be an original couple or couples, or else none of us would be here. Now, we've known for more than 150 years that the biblical stories of creation breathed the same air as the stories from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan. That really can't be disputed. Now, they tell us not what happened in history, but they tell us what ancient writers were saying about God or the gods. That's my opinion. Comparing and contrasting these ancient stories has been a staple of biblical studies for generations. But without getting into all the ins and outs, we can sum it all up, I think, pretty quickly. Israel's creation stories mirrored these other stories, but also distanced themselves from the common mindset of the day, at least in some respects. So both accepting and pushing back a little bit. For example, in Genesis 1, the creation of the barrier overhead to keep the heavenly waters of chaos at bay is a feature shared by other ancient creation stories. In Genesis, this barrier is called rakia, or the dome, or vault, or if you will, firmament from the King James Version, and the word firm is right there. It's a dome. In Genesis, however, creation, as contrasted to other ancient stories of the ancient world, Creation is a solo act by Israel's God alone and happens with no real exertion on God's part. God simply says, "Let there be," and there it was. In other ancient stories, creation is the result of gods in bloody conflict over who's going to rule the roost. Another distinction concerns how God looks upon humans. In Genesis 1, all humans were created in God's image and likeness for a very specific purpose, by the way, to rule over creation, especially the animals. Sort of as God's second in command. In other religions, however, such dignity is bestowed only upon royalty, not the masses. So there are interesting distinctions between it, but they're still breathing the same air. In Genesis 2, Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden to tend it in God's company, whereas other ancient stories portray humans as slaves to do the work that the gods do not want to deal with. Even in the story of Noah and the flood, which is a horrific story, no matter how you slice it, humans are looked upon differently than they are in other flood stories. In Genesis, humans are wiped out because of their persistent inclination towards evil, we read in chapter 6 of Genesis. But in one Mesopotamian story, humans are drowned because they were making too much noise and disturbing the gods' rest. Comparing these ancient stories is fascinating, at least for me, but both in how they are similar and how they are different. But this is not the time to tease all that out, or this would turn into a very different kind of talk. My point in going into any of this detail at all is just to emphasize one thing. The ancient Israelites understood their God, if you allow the expression, within the science of the day, within the way in which people understood the cosmos. That's why there's so many similarities between these various cultures and how they talk about creation. So the Israelites like I said, they drew some thick lines between the role that their God played compared to the role of the other gods. But everyone was working with, let's say, a broadly accepted picture of physical reality. And that picture is not the picture we see according to modern science, and we should not expect it to be. So in the same way, how we talk about the God of creation today, I think must also work like the biblical authors. We're actually following the Bible here in a sense, right? We must work within the broadly accepted current scientific picture of physical reality to say, what is this showing us theologically? And that means embracing a thought that never had to be and could never have been uttered through most of the history of Christianity and Judaism. Perhaps evolution is how God created. But what does that mean? God created through evolution. I think good question. But we don't need to arrive at sort of final quick answers here to that question. Theology's wheels turn notoriously slowly, and we don't need to have the answers before us first so that we can get on with the object of life and of faith. Working out challenging issues like this in real time is an expression of the life of faith. Saying, "I'm not sure," is an expression of what people do who are on a faith journey. I say I don't know all the time, because I don't. I should add, however, that when I say evolution is God's way of creating, I don't mean to suggest, and again, this gets back to Zach's very poorly phrased question that everyone else was responding to. I'm with you guys, not Zach. Zach, you would agree with me, I know, in this. You just weren't thinking when you wrote that question. I don't mean to suggest that evolution is God's way of creating. I don't mean to suggest that God intervenes from the outside and directs evolution like a conductor of an orchestra. I mean, at least what I think I mean, is that God inhabits the process of evolution, not micromanaging it from the inside, but by being the divine presence that lives in every particle of it. I'm not sure how that last sentence will strike you. I'm not sure how it strikes me, but this is what I'm thinking. And I'm simply trying to give some language to God that renders justice to what we know to be true about our universe. That's the science of our day. And just like the biblical authors, we have to work with that, not with something else. As much as evolution wreaks havoc with a literal reading of the creation stories in Genesis, to those so inclined, it could also help expand our minds to understand God differently. I deeply believe that's the Christian way. Creation is shouting to us something of the deep mystery of the character of God and of creation. And I think pitting evolution against the Bible or against Christianity or against God is a missed opportunity to make God, if anything, relatable to ourselves and to others. Unlike Dr. Matthew's brother. We can't have God language. Theology is always evolving, right? You can't have God language that only works in a pre-evolutionary cosmos. Who are we talking to? That doesn't even convince me, let alone people who are not part of the Christian faith or any faith. I think one way evolution drives us to think differently about God is that evolution is ongoing. God's creative work did not end at the dawn of time, which, by the way, Christian and Jewish theologians have known that all along. They never said this is it. They said things keep happening. But it is popular, I think, in some Christian contexts. Like, God did everything back then, that's it. No more creating going on. Some theologians add that an evolutionary cosmos implies a purpose to the universe. Evolution is heading toward a goal. And that idea greatly appeals to me. And if I were going to bring God and evolution together, if we're going to do that, it seems that maybe talking about purpose should be put on the table. The telos, the goal of all this. But, when we begin talking like I'm talking now, we have certainly left the realm of the Bible in any literal sense, which deals with none of these things. The creation as we understand it today is driving us to speak of God in ways that the Bible doesn't. Rather than seeing evolution as the enemy of faith that must be squashed, I see it as an opportunity to adjust what I think I know about God. And the God whom I see when I ponder the nature of life on this earth brings me to a humbling awareness that I am part of a big interconnected whole where God's creative presence and energy infuses all living things. Just a little more, just pretty much in closing, I want to say something about, something that's been meaningful to me is the larger context of evolution. I'll be very brief here, but human evolution is only one small part of a larger picture. Evolution is not simply where people come from or even how life as a whole came to be on our planet. It is the sweeping, all-inclusive scientific landscape by which we explain the cosmos and what it contains. Evolution is the big story within which we understand all of our physical reality. As theologian Ilia Delio puts it, she teaches at Villanova, by the way, you guys over here, you Villanova people, theologian. But she says, in my view, evolution is the story. Which interesting thing to talk about. What does that mean? Is that compatible with Christianity? All that stuff comes up to the surface, and I think they're great questions. But she says, in my view, evolution is the story. It is the meta-narrative of our age. It is not only a scientific explanation for physical reality, it is rather the overarching description of reality, the cosmological framework for all contemporary thought. That's rather provocative, I think, but it's worth thinking about. See, in other words, for me at least, it will not do to isolate human evolution and sort of deal with it, which is like the first two options that I mentioned before. Human evolution is simply part of a larger picture of what theologians like to call an emerging reality, an emerging creation. Things keep emerging. And I think that gives us an expanded vision of our understanding of God. I mean, as we know, our home planet did not pop into existence fully formed, but it emerged, evolved, as it were, metaphorically speaking, from gases and grains of dust orbiting the fledgling sun that were pulled together by gravity over many millions of years to form a sphere. Thus, the Earth began its 4.5 billion year transformation from an inhospitable furnace to a world of water and oxygen, magnetic poles that protect us from solar wind, ozone that shields us from ultraviolet rays, and hundreds of other tweaks and adjustments to make our world a home where evolution could yield an explosion of countless species of vegetation and animal life. Likewise, the cosmos as a whole was not always as it was now. That has been evolving for about 14 billion years. At least that's the Big Bang Theory, which is something I think cosmologists generally still agree with. There's some debate about it, but at least according to that theory, everything that exists was once condensed in one very small point called the singularity, which then exploded its energy out into the void. And after about 10,000 years, that energy began to coalesce into matter, right? Because energy and matter are two sides of the same coin. I don't understand a word Einstein said, but I think I get that much, that matter is basically coalesced energy. That's why when you take matter and disintegrate it, the energy remains. Those two things they're like that. But it took a while for matter to form. And I'm glad that it did, because matter is very important. It's huge. It makes up everything we can see or touch, including us. Very large objects in the matter category are stars, of course, which began forming when the universe was somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 years old. And we really can't say enough about stars. They're extremely important in our cosmos. Before they came along, all we had was hydrogen and helium, with maybe a little lithium, beryllium, and boron, elements 1 through 5 on the periodic table of the elements that we've all forgotten. And they were the only elements. Those are great elements, don't get me wrong, but hydrogen's a big part of water, I understand, and helium, when inhaled, will make you a huge hit at kids' parties. Apart from that, they don't help us very much with respect to being alive. What are needed are nitrogen, oxygen, sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and iron, just to name a few. They were formed when the first 5 elements came together to form stars, and then for some reason I don't understand, stars create thermonuclear fusion reactions which lead to the creation of those other elements, and then when the star can't handle it anymore, it explodes, and those things like dandelions, they go all over the place, right? That's because, these vital elements do us no good tucked away in stars. They have to get someplace, and they have. Those stars exploded, supernovas, and they blasted those elements out into the universe. And again, like dandelion seeds in the wind, the elements from some of those explosions hitched a ride on cold rocks. And as in our case, they found their way to our planet, where they encountered the right conditions for life, which we don't know where it came from, right? And along the way, stars came together under the pull of gravity, hundreds of billions of them, to form galaxies, and those galaxies formed galaxy clusters. And have you ever seen those pictures of the universe, like a map of the whole universe that shows galaxy clusters and these like tendrils between them? It's like you're looking at a brain almost. It's got these connections, and it's absolutely fascinating. No, that's not the brain of God. I'm just saying, it looks like a brain to me, and I just think it's fascinating, and here we are talking about it, which is amazing. We're people, evolution's pretty cool. We're conscious about consciousness. We think about thinking, right? I'm not sure if dolphins do that. They may, but we do, right? So it's a beautiful thing. Anyway, the point of this possibly traumatic stroll through memories of high school science classes is simply to remind us of a bit of common knowledge. The universe did not appear as it is now. It began very small and literally blew up and is still expanding, growing, changing, developing. Like the earth and life on it, the universe emerged a long time ago and continues to blossom. For those of us who believe that a creator is responsible for all there is, that creator seems to be in the habit of creating not once and done, not in fixed permanence, but by constant emergence. This creates in me a jaw-dropping sort of deer in the headlights awe where I think words, despite the last 45 minutes, words are out of place. A changing, unfolding universe, I think, does not rob God of glory, but I think it declares it if we're willing to listen. Right, that's it for me. Thank you. And questions? Okay. Yeah, I think I appreciate the question. It is a very common question that genealogies seem to be, the whole purpose of them is to be historical. Without going into like a very long answer, genealogies perform a theological function, especially in Genesis. So to say that because their names are maybe more historical than other things, maybe yes, maybe no. There may be oral traditions where they have names and they put them in. Genesis 5 has a lot going on, and it pairs with Genesis 10. You have two priestly genealogies in the opening chapters of Genesis, both of which are 10 generations. One's to get you to Noah, the other one's to get you to Abraham. Oddly, 10, exactly 10. Yeah, I mean, just, thinking of the genealogy in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, they're very different. Very different. In some cases, maybe even not completely compatible, right? So I think the genealogies, they form functions of theological value. That, I'm going to suggest the writers, if we could ask them, if you could push them a little bit, they might say, well, yeah, we think this is what happened, whatever you mean by happened. We're ancient people, we don't talk like that. But, they might. But in the same way that I think the writer of Genesis 1 was probably actually saying, God created the world in 6 days. I take that morning and evening thing very seriously, by the way. I think that's what the writer is trying to communicate. I just want to say that we have to treat this more symbolically and metaphorically, like Maimonides says and whatnot, because, again, the point is that ancient people are speaking in ways about God, who's other, but within the context of their antiquity and how they understood everything else. And that includes genealogies. Right. I think that's a very good question. I think the way to maybe safeguard that pitfall is to maintain a mindset of dialogue and conversation and to hold the thoughts loosely. I mean, I think I'm pretty right with what I just said, but I'm holding it this way because, again, what do I know? I also think, maybe, I hope this is getting at what you're asking, but looking at the world around us as a way of understanding God is, I think, very ancient. That's not a new thing. And when we have new discoveries in science, I just think it's, wow, that's fantastic. I'm not sure how this all relates, but it makes me curious. That's what it does. It makes me realize how little I know, and it brings to me an attitude of curiosity about the world I live in and about the God that I believe is behind it, right? There's nothing in this about proving God, right? Which I think some people go like the God of the gaps thing that Dr. Meneses was talking about last hour. I don't think that's a good idea, but I do think that this is an ancient way of coming to our understanding of God, the creator and creation, the distinction between the two, but then what theologians call the God and world problem, how God relates to the world. And I think evolution is one entry point to talking more about that. But we have to be open to alternate explanations and alternate ways of thinking about this stuff too, right? For me, it's just very important that conversation is very, very important, right? And not to render what thinking people say about physical reality null and void because it doesn't match something. So
I'm going to disagree with probably the main essence of the thrust of the talk, and more so what you said of your colleague in Villanova, that evolution is the story. Evolution is not the story. God is the story, and bringing Him glory is the purpose and meaning to life. I've also got an answer which I'll end with to what is it that makes us human. I'll get to that in a second. Your colleague in Villanova, some things like, that evolution is a sweeping hermeneutic on how to understand all of reality. Absolutely not. And when we couch our reality in those confined terms, we'll never get an answer to what is it that makes us human. We are so far beyond the animalistic and evolutionary nature of the physical world. So, it's not what is it that, evolution is what explains reality, but it doesn't explain what it is to be real. So what I'm doing in my research right now is I'm developing a cognitive architecture of God. Okay, and I've studied in cognitive neuroscience. I have learned more about God and the mind of God and the minds of humans since becoming a Christian. I did my PhD before I was a believer. After I graduated, I became a believer. I had a Christian worldview for some time. Now, I'm fine with throwing out creation. Totally fine with that. Fine in embracing evolution. I have no objection to that. But where I draw the line is making evolution or any part of science, take science as a total, the lead case. You know, it used to be philosophy was a handmaiden of theology. It can be that science is the new handmaid of theology, but it can't be that theology is a handmaid of science. You know, we've got the cart before the horse. So getting back to what is it that makes us human, now when I'm trying to answer that question as a Christian cognitive neuroscientist, the answers are in the Bible and they are not in neuroscience. It falls short. I'm taking an approach in that research, and I'm not trying to plug the research, it's just, it needs to come more center stage. You know, the first commandment, that's where the answer is, which is loving God with our heart and our soul and our mind. What is it to be human? It's to have a heart and a soul and a mind, and all of those in direct communion with God. So what my research will culminate in, oddly enough, and it's very scientific, is a mathematical equation of each of those three dimensions of love, and how they not just reveal what our relationship to God should look like, but that relationship being there defined because it reflects who God is. So, you know, maybe this time next year I'll be able to come back and present what the mathematical equation of God's heart, soul, and mind looks like. But we will never get to a full understanding if we are only the mind. It's going back to the Enlightenment days. Where we are not just the mind, we are heart and soul as well. Unless they come to the table, that answer will always.
Right. Well, I would say, I mean, I appreciate that. I would say first, Ilia Delio is not a devotee of Enlightenment thinking. She's a contemplative theologian, and so that one quote will not give the whole perspective of what she's saying, and I read it to be purposely provocative to sort of get people talking. I will say that it is the story in the sense of like how everything that we have is a result of emergence, something that started with a singularity, and here we have it, right? That's simple. That's what she means by this is the story of how things came to be. I can tell you for a fact, Ilia does not think like this explains everything there is, because she's also she describes, you know, prayer as quantum entanglement with divine energy. You can't explain that scientifically, right? That's a weird way of putting it. I sort of disagree with her on how she says it, but still, the point is that there's more to it than this. But she's saying we have to acknowledge how things came to be, even to talk about the reality of God is our starting point. Well, the faith in the reality of God is a starting point, but God's in the details. I shouldn't say the devil's in the details. God's in the details, right? Like, what does that mean? And, you know, we could probably have a really great discussion. You say the Bible has the answers. I'd say I'd like to see where those answers are, because all those answers are also contextual. Not to get into it here, this is not the time. But the Bible also creates theological problems for, like, the diverse portraits of God in the Bible. How violent is God? Right, things like that. It's just, the Bible puts us on a hermeneutical and theological adventure that we have to tease out and then bring into conversation with what we know about reality as best as we can understand it at any given point in time. And this is why, you know, there was a time when God was a divine watchmaker, right? This is a Newtonian mentality, right? And that happened, and people don't really think that way anymore. And now we think of God differently, maybe in evolutionary terms and things like that. So our context is always intertwined with how we talk about God. Yeah, but the Bible is itself a diverse collection, an anthology of literature written over a long period of time that is also in cultured communication. Well, but I'm not saying, you're not saying this, but we want a book that's going to give us all the answers. Yeah, oh well. We don't have that. What we do have is the incarnation. which seems to revel in this intersection with humanity, right? Which I think is a beautiful thing. But to me, that's the beginning of the discussion, that kind of a claim, not the end of it. So, but it's a very good set of questions. I appreciate it. So anyway, hello, George.
I think that the continuation of creation is stated by Christ when he says, "My Father worketh, so do I."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My question, in a way, is between two stems, and that is, since the context is very important, and so when I grew up in the communist countries, there were two stamps that were important. One was the American astronauts. When they went around, the stamp was, "In the beginning, God."
Yeah.
The stamp that came out. And then Yuri Gagarin, the Russian cosmonaut, went, and the stamp was "Nema Boga," which means there is no God.
Right.
So Yuri was a picture looking for God in the universe, and we just could not find him. So my question within that context is, and I just thank you for the presentation. My question is within the Old Testament. At which point we hear God talking about himself, oneself? Because your statement was, this is how the authors have imagined God. Is God ever revealing anything about oneself, or is the whole Old Testament the imagination of various authors about who this God could be? And then the second part is there any historical event in the Old Testament that you consider historical based on 2022 historical analysis?
All right, sit down. The second one, let me just, I mean, here's the problem with the second part. I mean, I think about that all the time, right? If by verifying historical events, typically what that means in historiography is you can sort of compare and contrast, and you can sort of have evidence outside of that culture that you're studying, right? That really starts in the Old Testament period in the 9th century. We start having overlap with different cultures, namely Assyrian culture, because they were a big pain in the neck back then, right? The further back you go, the less you have. And that's just a reality. And so people decide, now, the Exodus or the patriarchs or creation or the flood, those kinds of things can all be discussed, but we don't have anything to go on compared to later on. I think things like, the existence of the monarchy, the exile, the later events, those are things that if we're interested in corroboration from outside sources, not just people who wrote the stories, but from outside sources, it helps, right? But where the line of history is drawn, that's one of those things I hold like this. It's like, it gets really complicated once you start looking at the details. The first question, I'm forgetting what you said. Do you remember what it was, the first question? It was 10 minutes ago.
God himself revealing.
Oh, is God revealing, right? Or is it just human imagination or God revealing? You're not going to like this answer. The answer is yes. Why can't both of those things coexist? And again, this is not an escape hatch. It's something that I'm very committed to that I also don't understand. Incarnational way of thinking, right? How can Jesus be both human and divine? Well, God seems to work in certain ways. And, we have different takes in the Hebrew Bible on Israel's entire history. You've got Samuel, Kings over here, and Chronicles over here. They're telling a different story. Well, they're just making stuff. I don't know if they're making things up, but they're telling stories for a certain reason. And the question is, why can't God be a part of that? Right? So I think the question is a very good one. I just think the answer for me, it gets really hermeneutical and textual and very drawn out. And so I say, yeah, God's involved, God's there. But we're seeing that God through the lens of people and their, let's say, genuine religious experience, right? And that is something that, let's say, God uses or God even involves himself in to create, right? To me, that's the beginning point of conversation, though. That doesn't solve the big issues. So, okay, thank you, George, for your question. So,
last question. Thank you so much
sure.
for your talk. I think your last comments may have thrown us off just a little bit, actually, because you say kind of both. I've read some of your work, and I think your talk here to me sort of sometimes sets up one of the, is the Bible a book of wisdom or is it a rule book? I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think sometimes it's both. So this talk, either you read Genesis literally and you throw out evolution, or you can read it metaphorically and accept evolution. I think there's a lot of Christians who read it as I think it should. I agree with a lot of what you said. It's an ancient text, and you need to bring the context in. I really like John Walton's sort of analogy of the temple inauguration.
Of Genesis 1, you mean? In Genesis 1, right, yeah.
So what about the Christian who does read Genesis 1 metaphorically, if you, for lack of a better term, but also embraces intelligent design rather than...
To me, I think that's the intelligent design piece would have to be adjudicated by people who deal with the science. And, I used to work for the BioLogos Foundation. It was many years ago, 2009 into 2010. And so I engaged a lot with intelligent design, and at least the perspective of BioLogos is that doesn't really explain the data, right? But I can't speak in any authoritative way to that. But I would just say, well, listen, if you think that, that's okay. I can't tell them whether they're right or wrong or not. But to me, it strikes me as being outside of the general scientific consensus, and that needs to earn its way into the conversation more. And I don't think it's done that at this point. And I don't think people are just dismissing it because it's not mainstream science. I think they're saying there are problems here scientifically. That's why I have to listen to other people, because I'm not a scientist. I'm just not. I really wanted to be. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronomer. But I'm not going to stay up all night, Catherine, like you do. And I can't do math. So I'm done. That's just the end of that. So I know I'll do Bible. So, which is relatively easier, by the way. It's a set corpus of material. You don't get too sidetracked from it. But so yeah, I would throw that into the laps of others who can adjudicate those things. And I'm just going to listen to that conversation.
But you do accept that there's Christians who read Genesis 1 in the same way you do, but also reject, right?
Evolutionary theory. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, in other words, there are hybrid solutions, let's say, and let's call intelligent design. I don't mean this to sound insulting, because I really don't, but it's more a peripheral scientific endeavor rather than a mainstream scientific endeavor, right? Now, you may disagree, that's fine, but embrace the margins. Yeah, embrace the margins. Yeah, and so, and that hybrid solution, listen, I understand the metaphorical stuff, I just don't buy evolution, I think this is a better solution. Okay, that's a different conversation, but those people exist, certainly, yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.